Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban. Welcome to episode 389 of the podcast. It's October 21st, 2020. My guest today is Elisabeth Swan. She is the co-author of the book, The Problem Solver's Toolkit, and she's co-host of a podcast called The Just-in-Time Cafe. As her bio says, she's been helping people successfully build their problem-solving muscles for over 30 years, and she loves what she does every single day. So today we discuss brainstorming, and we use an article she wrote for GoLean6Sigma.com as the starting point, and it's titled, and the headline is addressed to green belts, and probably applies to everybody. Group brainstorming is a waste of time. So why has classic brainstorming proven to be ineffective, especially in the context of Lean, Six Sigma, or process improvement? And how can it be better given the reality of remote teams? Our conversation also veers into talking about Elisabeth's history in improv comedy and how lessons from the improv approach influence her to this day. So she says, structure sets you free. Why is that in improv or Lean Six Sigma? We'll talk about that and more. So if you'd like to find links to her book, her podcast, that article, and more, you can go to leanblog.org/389.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us here, Elisabeth.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Thanks for having me.
So, before we get into topics of brainstorming and problem solving, I always like to ask guests to kind of think back to where and when and how you first got introduced to Lean Six Sigma, or however it was being framed when you got started with this type of work.
Yeah, it's an interesting start. It wasn't necessarily terribly planned, but I was working for a firm called Rath and Strong. They actually started in 1935. They were involved in helping Japan rebuild after World War II, and I learned from people who wrote the book about just-in-time manufacturing or setup production, and just early on. But I was helping them just fix their some of their presentations, like the way they were in front of the room and how they were training, and whether this stuff was accessible to other people. So I was working on those projects, and at the same time, this is like 1989. I started doing improv comedy, and that was serendipitous as well. But yeah. I took a course and then got invited into the troupe. So I ended up performing for a bunch of years with Improv Boston, and a few other troupes. There was one that was a Canadian-based one, International Improv, and that was set up almost like a hockey game. You would jump into the rink and be, two teams, and the fans would vote on who won it. But I think getting into improv, it opened up my kind of mind in terms of what I wanted to do. And the folks I was working with said, well, why don't you come with us? Because you're obviously good on your feet, and not just design this training, but help us work with groups. So I dove in and kind of learned on my feet from a lot of great consultants, and got my start there. And, sort of kept going. I won't bore you with the rest of it, but that's how it started, which is really interesting because I was intrigued by these guys, and then I was like, oh, okay, well, I could actually do this. And then, 30 plus years later.
Yeah. So I'm curious because, and I've talked a little bit with one of our team members at KaiNexus, Bree Hudock, who has done a lot of improv comedy work through college, and I think she's still, was pre-pandemic, was dabbling with that in person in Austin. And I'm curious, are there lessons you've learned about having enough structure to then build off of when you do the performance? How much is that like improvement work, where we may have structure, but yet in the moment we're having to figure it out and improv maybe with our improvement?
Yeah, I mean, I use improv every day, and what you're saying is what I say to myself and others, which is structure sets you free. So having, plan, do, check, act, having a structure and working through means within that, you've got the chance to go with what that process, that problem, that issue is driving. So being able to respond in the moment to, okay, that's different, but I know the structure I'm following. I think that's key to success.
And I love the way you put that. Structure sets you free. I mean, I think that connects to ideas of standardized work. And sometimes where people misunderstand and they think standardized work is meant to be stifling. But I think there are a lot of situations where the right amount of structure allows us to be creative when tap into creativity at times and being adaptable instead of being too rigid.
I think your example of standard work is great because I agree with you. People think, oh, so you have to set up the way it's done. It's like, no, you have to always know the current best way. So you're part of that. And if you see a way to make that better, your job is to immediately add and say, this is what I think we can do better. And so it's like you say, that's creativity. It should always be a creative process.
Yeah. And when improv, of course, is not scripted. And, a lot of healthcare work in particular can't be scripted to the level of detail of automotive assembly, where, in a car plant, you have known work that repeats predictably in 50-second cycles. But healthcare still has applications for standard work, and knowing roles and responsibilities and having enough structure to react to what might be an unheard of type of incident, patient type that comes into the ER. So I think, I think there's a phrase I learned from Toyota mentors, enabling bureaucracy is one phrase that they've used, which I think is interesting to think about.
I like that. I think that is a more concrete way of saying structure sets you free.
But we don't like the word bureaucracy just sets people off, though. So I think structure sets you free is probably, to me, that's a better way of saying it, I think. So I'm curious also, we're going to talk here a lot about brainstorming. Can you tell us more? I always like to talk to authors about their books as well. The Problem Solver's Toolkit, if you can sort of, talk about the book. And I'm always interested also how it came to be.
The thrust of, my career and Tracy's, and Tracy is my colleague and co-author, has always been, how do we translate what this process is? What is this structure that is going to help you get where you want to go? How do we translate so that that is accessible to as many people as possible? And I have found that when I was, learning early on, that I found that my own process of trying to understand any particular tool or concept, I really had to break it down for myself. And especially when it got into, bigger concepts like hypothesis testing or something. But I wanted to, I didn't even take statistics in school. I will admit right out there. So really had to dive in, make sure that I understood things to a granular level such that I can present it to somebody else in a way that was immediately understandable. So we always play the role of translator, because there can be an aspect to our world of continuous improvement that can get a little geeky, can maybe favor the mechanical engineer, and so coming from the English major side of the house, it's like, okay, well, how does this make sense to me and others like me? So this book was a way of saying, okay, if you had to boil it down, here's a structure, here's some examples. And whereas I think a lot of people, it was like, well, here's the tool, here's how you use it. And we looked at it and said, what are all the ways this goes wrong? So we wanted to really speak to people about, this is not rocket science, but it doesn't mean right off the bat how to do this. So here's all the ways. And so we talked about it as a journey, because we thought, and I'm sure you've talked about it too, that these are all journeys. When you're doing this process improvement, we said, so you're on a road trip, you're on this journey, you're on a road trip, and you're going to hit some potholes. So we wanted to say, what are the detours? How do you manage the potholes? And then what if you wanted to like know even more? So we said that you could go sightseeing. You want to know more about standard work? Okay, here's some sightseeing you could go on and learn more. And so the idea of taking this journey and making it literal, you're on this road trip, and we could take someone just 35 basic tools, because there's compendiums out there. Like, here's 100 things you can do. It's like, let's just focus on the things that, will get you there, get you on this journey. So I don't know if that helps with the thinking behind it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thinking of a journey, or I've become partial to the word practicing over the years. So, I want to bring it back to, you use this phrase, building problem-solving muscles, right? So for people who are watching the video, in this room where I sit, it's partly my office, but my wife, not while I'm doing podcasts, but she practices yoga in here. And she's been practicing. She's been at this for a very long time. She makes it look easy, where, then the times I have tried yoga, I find it intimidating. It's challenging. And I think there are interesting parallels maybe to problem solving, to throw it back to you, where if somebody reads about problem solving or sees somebody leading some sort of problem solving activity, it might look easy, but that person has practiced and built that muscle over time. It's not so much a question as it is a thought to get your reactions from.
No, I like it. I love that. And you're absolutely on target, that it is a practice. And to build those muscles, you do have to practice, even if it's yoga. Mm-hmm. It feels like, so foreign. But yeah, things feel foreign until you play with it and do it. And I think that you have to have that to build the muscles. Absolutely.
And it starts with that first step of using light weights, if you will, and working your way up. Like the surest path, I'm sure, for someone to hurt themselves is to watch a video of an Olympic weightlifter and then say, oh, okay, well, I studied what they did. I'm going to go try that. You've got to work your way up.
Yeah. And I think, we initially, the other springboard for the book was people were taking our online training and they were like, yeah, but I want something tangible to hold. And the other aspect was, okay, so you want what you said, you want people to practice. So making things accessible and say, okay, well, here's how it happens in this little place called the Bahama Bistro.
Yeah.
And you think, oh, well, I've been in restaurants. I've seen, what it takes to, so then it to practice it doesn't feel so foreign. Like, oh, I know what that means. Okay, I could measure how long it takes for me to get an order, or I could look at the way they're building my sub as I, go through this line.
Yeah. So then, there's also, we've talked about yoga and weightlifting. There's an obvious parallel, I guess, to the martial arts. So maybe let me ask, like, what are your thoughts? And as admittedly somebody, I don't label the work that I do Lean Six Sigma or Six Sigma. And, it's just different backgrounds, different training, different origin stories. But I was going to ask you, because this is something we don't often talk about here in the podcast, the different levels of belts and how things are structured, or at least, with your work at Go Lean Six Sigma, how do you structure things to kind of progress through those levels of belts so that it's not super intimidating? You don't create a master black belt overnight. But what are some of the steps, and can you kind of talk about how you help people progress along the way without being intimidated and scared off or hurt?
Yeah. It's funny. The belts came in, not so much. I think Bill Smith was the originator of Six Sigma, and Michael Harry came up with the belt levels. And it's almost like they're both kind of a marketing gimmick. Like, wow, I could be a black belt, I could be a green belt. But for me, what's helpful is it helps me understand what level of training and practice are you interested in, do you need? And when we started it, we said, okay, let's put a 8-hour yellow belt, right? So that's 8 hours of here's, process of improvement, start to finish, here's a case study. at the bistro. We put that online for free. Like, okay, we'll help people get rolling. And for a lot of people, that's all they needed. And they just started practicing, doing a project, saying, okay, if that's what the bistro did, I'll try this in my, admin process. And then once we had created that, it was like, okay, well, if you want to then run teams, and if you want to take your learning to the next level, well, let's expand that and take everything you learned in Yellow Belt, and let's do more dives and open up the toolkit, and let's take that out to, I think it's 32 hours, 34 hours, something like that. And let's really challenge you more to go try getting a voice of the customer, go, describe what is standard work for you. So working those levels from enough to be dangerous into, okay, now I want to just be a team lead and get rolling. And then black belts, I think some of that is driven by folks with who really are getting into it and want to make that's what I do. Right? I want to be going on this track. I want to really enhance my ability to do the more advanced. We sort of separated out. I think some people would throw the entire toolkit into green belt. We'll pull like really deep dives on MSA, measurement systems analysis, and hypothesis testing and design of experiments. We'll say, okay, well, those are really tactics that you don't need as often. So let's reserve those for folks who really want to educate themselves at a higher level. Mm-hmm. And master black belt, that is really experience-based. You have got to be someone who has run a lot of projects. You've been coaching a lot of folks. And so that's not something I think you can just go learn online. That's really, you're sort of building in that direction. But we have come around to like, okay, champions need guidelines. If you're going to try to help leverage folks that have had all this training, then, here's some things that help you with leader standard work and becoming someone who drives fear out of the organization. More of those, the ways to create that culture that can support all the process improvement efforts. And then way back at the beginning, we sort of extracted an hour from and called it white belt and said, okay, that if you just want to know what the heck are my people talking about? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so here you go. Here's like an outline of what it is. So is that helpful?
Yeah, it is. So we're going to take that deeper dive into problem solving and topics around brainstorming. And I'll make sure we link to this in the show notes, an article that you wrote. I think it's maybe addressed at green belts the way the title is written, but maybe also addressed more broadly. Pretty blunt, direct title. Group brainstorming is a waste of time. And that'll catch people's attention, right? Because I think back to even at some point as a child being taught brainstorming methods in school, and some of the tenets of brainstorming, like, don't criticize ideas, wild ideas are okay, build upon the ideas of others. It's like this, if you will, I know it's like a group improv activity. But from your standpoint, why? What did you learn in researching and writing this article about this idea that brainstorming is a waste of time, or that there's maybe a better approach?
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating to me on many, many levels, because I've been dabbling in here for a long time. Obviously, I've been a facilitator, a coach, a teacher. And I also worked for a brief time with a company called Idea Champions. And they did a lot of strategic planning, but part of what we really focused on was ideation techniques. How do we get groups to come up with better ideas? And I look back on it now and I think, because we needed techniques. We needed, back to our structure sets you free. How do we line people up such that they get those wild ideas, that they unleash? And what I discovered was, like you said, you were doing this. You were aware of this as a young guy. And I looked, and Alex Osborne, who coined the term brainstorming, this comes from, he coined it in 1939. So we've been hearing this for over 80 years, and it's really attractive. We all gravitate and go, yeah, like what's not to love about don't criticize. Who wants to be criticized? Like, and be freewheeling and groups. That all sounds so great. So I was all in, but I kept bumping up against two things. One was I wasn't always overly impressed with what was, appearing on the flip charts.
Like in what way or why?
Oh, quality of what people were saying. I felt like, I'm a good facilitator. My improv background was great. But I felt like often it was kind of a push. Like, how do we push past some of these pedestrian ideas and get something that's a little more elegant? And what I found a couple things. One was that there were these studies way back, like 10 years after Osborne wrote a book called Your Creative Power, talked about the squad brainstorming. You were supposed to get 50% more better ideas, as a group than individuals. And in just 10 years later, there was a Yale study that they took 48 people. They did, 12 groups of 4. So the group brainstorming, and then a control group of just 48 singles people. And these are guys. This is 59. So, and I looked at Yale didn't go co-ed until 69. So wow. It was just 10 years later, but anyway, so these are all guys, but they had they were tasked to solve a traffic congestion problem. And it's funny because they had judges, they had 3 ways to qualify the ideas, were they, the total ideas produced, the total number of unique ideas produced, and they had 3 separate measures of quality. Like, were these good ideas? And like overwhelmingly the individuals performed better than the group. And then I thought, okay, that was, and it's a surprise. And what's also a surprise, that was 10 years after Osborne published Your Creative Power. But it just gets swept aside. Brainstorming is just too attractive. The group brainstorm is just too attractive. So, and there's other studies. They keep coming back to it. And I think the main thing they came up against was something that you'll relate to. It's production blocking. It's saying only one person can voice an idea at a time. It's theory of constraints, right? Back to Goldratt, it's saying, you just can't get that many if you've got a group. So looking at that, and then people have other theories on what the other problems were. But when I was researching this, because the other thing I found was, and I got this one from my group at Idea Champions, a guy named Mitch Ditkoff, who's still the CEO there. He taught me to ask the group before I did brainstorming, where are you? What are you doing when you get your best ideas? And I would hear, and I'd write it on the flip chart, in the shower, walking the dog, driving my car, eating, whatever. It was like all these things. And I would always joke at the end, none of these said conference room. Nobody said at work, at my desk. And that was kind of a preliminary when I was back at Idea Champions to, okay, so we're going to use these techniques. We're going to use anti-solution. We're going to use all these different techniques to help you.
What is that when you say anti-solution? I don't know that one.
Anti-solution is built on the fact that we are critical thinkers. I always think of my little nephew. My mother was bringing some like a desk lamp in the door one time, and he looked at her and he goes, and he's just staring at it and he goes, I know how to break that. Like, that's how we're built. We know how to break things. We know how things won't work. So when you take anti-solution, you say, what's the opposite of what I'm trying to do? If I'm trying to get patients to doctors from door to dock as fast as possible, my anti-solution is built on how do I make it take the longest possible time for patients to get from door to doctor. Yeah. And then people are freewheeling. They're like, oh, I know. And you get this whole list in a nanosecond, and people are laughing. It's funny. Don't leave that list up, because then people go, oh my God, that's what we do. Like, this is horrible. Where did this come from? So But anti-solution will let you cut loose, but then you've got to reverse those and say, okay, where would we go? What's the reverse of that? But again, I sometimes felt like those are very pedestrian. Okay, well then don't do that. That's not. So anyway, that's one of the techniques. So once I looked at, so I was looking at different reasons why we don't come up with better or more ideas in groups, and that's when I stumbled on this guy, Neil Herman, and he did a study that was published in Scientific American in 97. And he looked at the different brain waves, the frequency of brain waves. And he said there's 4 levels. You got beta waves when you're in a conversation, doing what we're doing, right? We're going back and forth. These are beta waves. Mm-hmm. Alpha is a moment of reflection or meditation when you're trying to do your yoga. Or maybe not. And then theta is when you are doing something rote. You're showering, you're walking the dog, and what those moments are like. Your brain is kind of free to go. And then delta is a deep sleep. Mm-hmm. So his studies showed that we do our best thinking. We come up with the best ideas in those moments of theta waves. So when we're doing those rote tasks, you often see people who can knit while they're talking, and there's all these things that you can do without really having to focus on them, but somehow having your physical body engaged frees up your mind.
Have you ever had somebody in a workshop, sorry to interrupt, who knits while they're sitting in class? I've had that happen once or twice.
And what did you say?
Well, I think when it's happened, that person was sort of upfront apologetic, or sort of saying like, I'm not doing the knitting because I'm not paying attention, but it helps me focus. And I'm like, okay, well, hey, yourself, to each your own. Maybe I'll ask for a scarf if the class goes well.
Honestly, yeah, if it's a week-long class, I think you should at least get a scarf out of that. But yeah, it probably helped her focus.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, interrupting doesn't help with.
Yes, it does. You had a good idea. So that was a good thing to throw in there. Because I think you're right. I think that is, for some people, a focusing mechanism. And I think I've heard this from people who have ADHD, whatever that is, attention deficit disorder, that they want to be, if they can be physically engaged, like have a job that makes them move, landscape work, do carpentry. That is when that sort of, it calms their minds. That they find that as like you said, it's a focusing mechanism. So that's interesting. Yeah. But reading Herman's study, it was like, oh, that answers what I saw on the flip chart. That's why everybody said that's where they got their best ideas. So, and another thing that triggered this was the pandemic. Like, okay, now we can't be in that room together. Zoom calls, we're all getting used to it, but it's not necessarily a great platform for everyone chiming in. It's, there's a lot of stutter steps and sorry, were you speaking and all that. So, how do you get that group brainstorming? And the other thing that really was challenging for me was, but we want involvement. Like, that the people who can solve the problems are the people who do the work. So we want to include them. We want to include stakeholders and people in the process with solving the process problems. So this idea of like only going to individuals is not appealing. I see why group brainstorming is so appealing. But what struck me was, this is another thing that's happened to me because I'm in an online company that is completely remote and we have no central office.
Yeah.
So we use a tool. I think we've changed over time. We had Trello for a while. Now we have Asana. And without making it a standard work, it became standard work to, when asking people for information, we give them a date and say, by Friday, we want to, I want to know all your thoughts around how do we either solve a problem or, what books would you like to recommend that we all should read together? Like, what is the task at hand? And then each of us gets a task assigned to us with a due date. And then it says, put all your ideas in this mother list, like right here, so everyone can see what people are adding. And I loved it. I was like, oh man, I get time to think about it. I can see what other people are adding. I can see what's done and I can keep going. And then by Friday, we've got this brilliant list of whatever it is. So I found that to me became an impetus for, okay, how do we work that into the brainstorming process? Because then we still have a discussion. We still get together as a group, but now we've got this great way to take advantage of that theta thinking, for, lack of a better.
What I hear you describing seems like sort of a hybrid model where you can try to have maybe the best of both worlds, where breaking off or giving people time may help the Myers-Briggs introverts, people who are otherwise shy or intimidated by the setting, to come up and submit ideas on their own without losing the dynamic of being able to discuss or debate or, kind of consider which of those different ideas, looking at a quantity of ideas, how do we evaluate which one or ones seem worth going forward through a testing phase? I think it's an idea or a different question. I think is really interesting when I've worked with teams is, how do we know if an idea is a good idea or not? Sometimes something that seems like a great idea turns out not to be so in practice. And sometimes the idea of we're not sure, but wouldn't hurt anything probably to try. Sometimes those counterintuitively prove out to be better ideas. So, and I know in your article you touched on quantity versus quality. I mean, quantity is easier to measure than it is to gauge quality sometimes. What are your thoughts?
I absolutely agree with you on that one. And you brought up another great point, which is getting those quieter folks to say something, the introverts. And that's something the facilitator used to work hard at. So now, like you're saying, it's a hybrid mechanism. Now this asynchronous process allows all people, regardless of their introverted or extroverted nature, to get the ideas in. So that solves, or that I think it goes a long way to solving that piece of it. Then the quality. And that was interesting because that's something I was poking at with that initial study, because they had 3 measures of quality. I was like, how did you? Because they had to have a judging panel, because that was tricky. Because you're saying well, how do you know?
Who is the panel?
Who's the panel? Yeah. And how are they judging the quality of these ideas? And it may have been, this was traffic congestion. So they may have had, this wouldn't, they had engineers or they had people who had solved it to say, this would work, this wouldn't work. But it isn't like an algorithm proof. I mean, what do you call it? What was the algebra proof? It wasn't like, okay, this either works or it doesn't work.
Right.
One thing that helps me, and I have 2 thoughts around this, because I think the quality issue is a hard answer. It's a hard thing to answer, but I have 2 things in mind that make a difference to me in the quality. And one of them is based on this other study. And this approaches that first rule of no criticism. Mm-hmm. So, when you were saying, okay, now we get back together and that's where we can have this discussion. What's critical is to have that discussion. That was the UC Berkeley 2003 study, and they said actually debate conditions produced better ideas. And again, I'm not entirely sure how they were judging the quality, but I do know that one was a really interesting article I read about Pixar, and that was in the guy Andrew Stanton was the director on most of this string of hits. I mean, if you think about the 3 Toy Stories, Finding Nemo, WALL-E, and there's no movie studio that had a string of 12 straight hits. That's just not something that happens in Hollywood. There's so many yes men around. It's like, well, then, invariably you get a bomb. So the article was looking at their process. What was different about Pixar's process? And what they did was this really rigorous 7 rounds of critique where everybody got to say, don't buy it. What about this? Don't get it. And just like you had withering critiques. So basically debate conditions in their development process. And then in the 90s, Disney tapped Andrew Stanton to do a live action movie for them called John Carter. I think the budget was like $300 million plus. A bomb.
Yeah.
And in the article, they asked him about his process. Did not use the 7 rounds of critique. So to me, what's really important is to have those debate conditions, but then back to that idea of no criticism. It's really appealing to have no criticism, like, who wants to be criticized? But another technique I got back with Mitch at Idea Champions is called likes, concerns, suggestions. And it forces you to start with your like. So back to critical thinking, I know how to break that. You have to hold that for a second and say, all right, what do you like about it? So now you've got to think about the elements of this idea that do work, that have potential. So you've got to do that form of critical thinking. And then you get to say your concerns. Say you have up to 3 concerns. My concerns are, but for every concern, you got to have a suggestion. So now you are building on that person's idea. So I found that process to be a great conduit to quality, because now you're getting into this engaged discussion of how do we get a better idea out of that. So that to me is a good guideline for pushing toward quality. And then I think, to me, again, I have to decide, how do we test these? If we've kind of convened as a group on these are the possibilities, you're going to still have some kind of a consensus around, all right, let's try this one.
Yeah. The word concern kind of sparks some different thoughts, just kind of delve into language a little bit here. And like you said, your background is in English studies, right? So you probably don't mind the detour into words. I mean, think about healthcare settings and training that I've gone through, where employees are not just lectured, you should speak up if you think there's a quality problem that's occurring or could occur, but they're taught how. They're taught a structure and a framework for how to speak up. And part of that structure, this was from an organization called Life Wings that teaches a methodology that's often called team steps more broadly. They coach nurses or whoever it might be, let's say in the operating room. Let's say if I were addressing you, I would say, Dr. Swan, I'm making you a doctor now.
Love it.
I'm addressing you by name. I'm getting your attention. I'm being respectful. I have a concern. Dr. Swan, I have a concern. And the thing that they teach is that stating, I have a concern, is a factually true statement. If I say, I have a concern, it's hard for you to say, no, you don't. It really kind of only begs the question of, well, what is the concern? And then as you discuss, it could turn out that the concern is unfounded, but sort of like in a lean environment where you're thanked for pulling the andon cord. That framing of concern, as opposed to saying, hey, doc, you're being an idiot here, or something that would really be disrespectful or drive defensiveness. I think that, so it's interesting to think about how saying, I have a concern about that idea, again, seems like, okay, factually true statement. Now let's carry the discussion on from there.
That's great. I think you're right in how much language matters. And I think there's feedback models that follow that as well, where it's, when you do X, I feel Y, and my suggestion is we do Z, or you change it to Z. And again, it's what you're saying, that you cannot refute how a person feels. And you cannot refute that someone has a concern. You could address it. You could say, actually, it's not a problem because of Y.
The concern could be grounded in a lack of information, and we can resolve that information gap.
But it's not threatening, and that's the goal is to get people to go in a positive direction, right? So you want people to come with you. So you definitely don't want to, start casting, why are you doing that? What's wrong with you? And we learned that early on in continuous improvement, that how we address folks and how we address issues can mean the path to solving it or a complete shutdown of any opportunity to do better. That as you say, that words matter.
So I'm tempted then to bring it back to the practice of improv and the structure and the lessons there. And again, I've seen improv troupes, and I know just a smidge. I don't know much about this. But one thing I've heard, and I'd ask you maybe to elaborate on, is the idea of yes and. If you're doing an improv scene with another individual, that's one of the things that's taught to help keep things going, right?
Yeah, and I would say the opposite of that, and this is when I first started learning, and it's a very basic technique, and you do a lot of practice. So thinking about improv and structure, that what's underneath that is you practice how to follow the structures. So we would practice yes and. Almost if you've ever played basketball, we used to do these layup lines where one person is going up, takes the layup, next person grabs the ball, goes to the back of the layup line. So we had these layup lines, and one person would make the offer. In improv, your lines are offers. So you say, you're looking at this other person, and you would say, I see you've come back from your journey with only one leg, or whatever it is. We often try to make an offer that gives the other person some kind of characteristic. We call it a gift. Gives them something to work with, right? And so the other person, the opposite of yes and might be, no, I didn't. Look I can dance a jig. You could refuse the answer, which we call blocking, and you might get an immediate laugh, but you've killed the scene. You've given the person nowhere to go. Mm-hmm. So yes and takes the offer and ups it. Yes, and I got the crown you asked me to get. So now, oh my God, you've given this other person a huge gift. You've given them a crown. There's some royalty, there's something, and they have somewhere to go. And that is a basic tenet. So yes, and I think that is also built into me now when I hear people talking, when I'm working in a class, when someone offers something up, I'm looking for, what can I do? How can I build on the idea this person just put forward? Where can we go with that? How does that forward this this project, this effort? So it is built in now.
Mm-hmm. And you make me think of short-term results versus long-term progress. Toyota famously says to make decisions based on the long term. And in the scenario you were talking about there, getting a laugh in the moment, if you're gauging the quality of what you said, you're like, okay, good, I got a laugh. This is a comedy troupe. I'm doing my job. But then killing the scene and ultimately having fewer laughs and a less enjoyable experience kind of makes me think of moments. And again, I share some of this, I've been guilty of this as an engineer, of those moments where I'm right. And I said that thing and I refuted what you just proposed, and I know I'm right, but what did that really accomplish other than in the moment feeling good of yeah, I was right. It's not the same as getting a laugh, but it makes me think of when we need to think about the longer term of what did I accomplish by shooting something down and being right. This is something I've tried.
Yeah. And so I think it is a similar sort of scene ender that leaves the person has nowhere to go. And you don't realize it often until reflecting later that, that ended that conversation, or that ended that effort. And you're mindful on stage of not just your fellow actors. How do I include them? Invite people into scenes. You're also mindful of, when you said long term, if you said early on something about the ball, right? There's the ball that's going to happen. Well, it's then get to it. Get to the ball. Don't stand around on stage being a talking head. There's going to be a ball. Is there going to be a ball? Yes. It's going to be big. It's going to be big. Yes. There's going to be people there. Yes. There's going to be there. It's no, just make it happen.
Yeah.
So I think that's another thing that I love, that the bias is for, let's go do that. Let's try that and see what that ball ends up looking like. And that is also appealing to me in the continuous improvement world of, okay, let's go try that out. Let's go make that happen. Let's not keep sort of churning about how it might or might not work.
Oh. And you mentioned reflection. Is that something that would be done at the end of an improv exercise or at the end of a show, that specific reflection cycle?
We would have reflections maybe on the next, like I've forgotten how often we met to practice, but the next practice we do take stock of the show, especially when I started out and I was in sort of a junior troupe, and it was, okay, here's some things, let me give you notes. And actually it's funny because when I was getting notes early on, the teacher initially would say, okay, that seems really good, and so she would immediately jump to the notes. And I said to her, you know what? It really is hard to hear that scene was any good when you get to the butt right away. I said, give it a second. I sort of taught her likes, concerns, suggestions. Like, revel a little bit in what worked so people can take in and repeat that. But then say your concerns with our performance, like you walked right through a bar. You ignored the prop that somebody put up there, and it's all imaginary, but or you sat there talking about the ball for 5 minutes there. And so, yeah, that was, you get time to sort of sit with it. And then it was like, okay, let's look at how we could do better.
Very cool.
Yeah, I can't believe that all that happened. We did improvised musicals, if you can imagine it. So inventing songs on the spot in a style of, like, it would be like a Dylan song, or it would be a gospel tune. Like, looking back, I'm like, how did we ever do that?
Wow. That often happens, to connect it back to continuous improvement. Sometimes people look and say, how did we ever do that? When they've solved some big problem or made a really large and sustainable change within an organization.
Yeah. How did that happen? Because many, many things came together for that to happen. You're right.
So as we wrap up here, can you tell the audience a little bit more about GoLean6Sigma.com?
Sure. We got together 8 years ago with the idea of, hey, what if we put some of the stuff we do in classrooms and workshops online? And I have to say, initially, I thought, well, we don't. Why would you do that? I mean, I had respect for my colleagues, but I was like, I don't know if this is going to work. Yeah. So we did it, and I really had to put myself through what, instructional design, like, how does this work? How do you engage online? How does this, make a dent in the way someone views processes? So that we initially put out, as I said, that sort of 8 hours free yellow belt, and said, okay, let's see if people enjoy this and if it works. And they did. So we just kept building. And so now we have this suite of online trainings, and we still keep looking at, what works and what to shift. And recently we've, especially with COVID, people had to give up, their on-site workshops, at least for the time being. And so we've really upped the amount of blended workshops, because, having that guide, having someone to talk to you after you've gone out, as you say, and practiced, right? I practiced this. I did a high level map, and I don't know if I'm doing this right. So then we get together online and we have breakout groups, and people can hear each other's struggles. And so that's been a really nice, I think, if there's nice things coming out of this pandemic, just that focus of how do we help folks bridge that gap between getting that face-to-face help and guidance and being able to go learn what they want to learn on their own. You can go study a concept, learn about standard work, take it in online, and then say, okay, now let's talk about what's that really mean. So that's been our latest effort, aside from just trying to get the word out, as you do, just like, how can we help people know how this can make a huge difference in, in your case, focusing in on healthcare. We've done a lot in government. I mean, just like these are things that affect all our lives. How do we make a better place for us? So that's been the focus.
Good. So I hope people will go check that out. GoLean6Sigma.com. I'm subscribed to your email newsletter, and there are always case studies and things for people to read and check out. And I will say, like, the visual style of everything is a lot of fun. Kind of when you talk about the Bahama, what's the cafe called again?
The Bahama Bistro.
Bahama Bistro Cafe, and just the drawings and the artwork and everything is inviting. And I think earlier you used the word accessible. So I think that's really cool to see that style. That's
so nice to hear, Mark. I agree with you. I think we have an awesome graphic team, but it made it approachable in the same way we hope the language did too. But yeah, and so nice to hear that say it draws you in.
Yeah, it does. So I want to thank again, our guest has been Elisabeth Swan. She's the Chief Learning Experience Officer at GoLean6Sigma.com. I encourage you to not only check out the website, but her book, and you said it was co-authored with Tracy O'Rourke, The Problem Solver's Toolkit. Last question, put you on the spot. Is there another book in you? That's the other thing I always like to ask authors. Are you going to do another?
Tracy said yes. She wants to. She just said this to me the other day. It's funny you ask. She wants to do an equally accessible book about coaching folks through their building their problem-solving muscles.
Yeah.
We'll see. Stay tuned, Mark.
Okay, good. And then I should have mentioned right up front, but I will mention and thank you again for taking part in both writing a blog post for and being part of the panel discussion webinar that we did called Root Cause Racism. And so I will put links to your blog post and a video of your remarks from that webinar in the show notes. I apologize I should have asked you about that here during our session, but maybe we can do another podcast episode at some point. But again, I'll encourage people to go check out what Elisabeth had to say there in those formats.
Thank you so much. And yes, that was an honor to be part of that. And you did a wonderful job hosting that. So yes, thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, well, sure. Thanks for being part of that. And again, we'll give a shout out to our friend Deandra Wardell, who really had the vision and the drop.
Go Deandra.
To invite you and all the others to be part of that, Elisabeth. So people can find that at leanblog.org/root cause racism. And again, I'll have other links in the show notes. But Elisabeth, thank you so much. I didn't know, I guess this is, podcast is sort of like improv. I didn't know it was going to veer in that direction of talking about improv, but I found that really interesting. So thank you for sharing that and everything else.
Loved it. Thanks so much for having me, Mark. This is awesome.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For Lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.